With nearly 1.5 million displaced Palestinians crammed into Rafah on Palestine's southern border, the world awaits Israel's next move. And Benny Gantz, one of three members of Israel's war cabinet, has given a clue.
The world must know, and Hamas leaders must know, if by Ramadan hostages are not home, the fighting will continue everywhere to include Rafah area.
Ramadan is expected to start on the 10th or 11th of March this year, less than 3 weeks away. And that is a terrifying threat from Benny Gantz. Ordinary Palestinians have, of course, no influence on whether the remaining Israeli hostages are released. So it's hard to see what Gantz said as anything other than a threat of collective punishment. Of course, collective punishment of Palestinians by Israel would be nothing new. More information is emerging about the abuses Palestinians in Gaza have had to endure at the hands of Israeli forces. A panel of UN experts has today expressed alarm over allegations of shocking human rights violations against Palestinian women and girls. The members of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls said this: "We are shocked by reports of the deliberate targeting and extrajudicial killing of Palestinian women and children in places where they sought refuge or while fleeing. Some of them were reportedly holding white pieces of cloth when they were killed by the Israeli army or affiliated forces. We are particularly distressed by reports that Palestinian women and girls in detention have also been subjected to multiple forms of sexual assault, such as being stripped naked and searched by male Israeli army officers. At least 2 female Palestinian detainees were reportedly raped, while others were reportedly threatened with rape and sexual violence." The group's members also expressed concern over allegations that on at least one occasion, Palestinian women detained in Gaza were kept in a cage in the rain and cold without food. The UN report isn't the only one detailing horrific violence against civilians in Gaza. This opinion article appeared in the Los Angeles Times this weekend. It has this headline: "I'm an American doctor who went to Gaza. What I saw wasn't war, it was annihilation." Irfan Galaria arrived in Gaza at the end of January, working at the Gaza European Hospital near Khan Yunis, a city then under continual Israeli assault. This is how he describes conditions in the hospital. "I began work immediately, performing 10 to 12 surgeries a day, working 14 to 16 hours at a time. The operating room would often shake from the incessant bombings, sometimes as frequent as every 30 seconds. We operated in unsterile settings that would have been unthinkable in the United States. We had limited access to critical medical equipment. We performed amputation of arms and legs daily using a giggly saw, which is a Civil War era tool, essentially a segment of barbed wire. Many amputations could have been avoided if we'd had access to standard medical equipment. It was a struggle trying to care for all the injured within the constructs of a healthcare system that has utterly collapsed." It's an absolutely brutal piece of writing, and this is one of the more disturbing accounts he gives. "I stopped keeping track of how many new orphans I had operated on. After surgery, they would be filed somewhere in the hospital. I'm unsure of who will take care of them or how they will survive. On one occasion, a handful of children, all about ages 5 to 8, were carried to the emergency room by their parents. All had single sniper shots to the head. These families were returning to their homes in Khan Yunis, about 2.5 miles away from the hospital, after Israeli tanks had withdrawn. But the snipers apparently stayed behind. None of these children survived." Now, snipers don't accidentally fire bullets into children's heads, so if true, this would amount to the most serious of war crimes. There have, of course, been many allegations of widespread atrocities committed by Israeli troops in Gaza, much of it coming from Palestinians and international organizations based in Gaza. But Israel is also providing plenty of evidence themselves, apparently completely unembarrassed by their abuses of the human rights of Palestinians. Now, most of that footage has been posted by IDF soldiers and settlers on social media platforms, so somewhat a disorganized fashion that this is being shared. But now Israeli TV station Channel 14 has aired a news segment showing the IDF's treatment of captive Palestinian men. In the footage, an IDF commander describes a group of Palestinian men bound, blindfolded, and kneeling on the ground as Hamas terrorists. Some of them, claims the commander, participated in the October 7th attacks, and he tells other IDF men that the men killed families and children and were picked up at checkpoints in Gaza. He also says that anyone who tries to fight arrest is killed. One younger soldier says he finds it hard to stand near the bound men. The commander says they all do, but there are no innocent people. Later in that clip, the commander interrogates one of the captured men, who says that on the 7th of October he was at home working in a furniture store. The commander then turns to the other soldiers and says, they all start like that, but eventually they tell the truth. Perhaps there's a connection between that phenomenon and torture. This report from Euromed Human Rights Monitor was published last week. According to Gazans detained by the IDF, the military tortured them naked and allowed Israeli civilians to watch. The report is based on multiple reports from former detainees held in 2 different detention camps on the border of the Gaza Strip. According to Euromed, the reports mark a worsening of conditions for Gazans detained by the IDF, who are also subjected to, quote, cruel torture, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrest, and denials of a fair trial, among other atrocities. Helena, that footage from Israeli news sort of showing, I mean, they're calling them a mass terrorist. It could be. I have no faith in due process by the Israeli military when it comes to Palestinians. We know they essentially kidnap lots of people without any kind of charge. That's gone really viral on social media, I think, because people are sort of shocked that the Israelis seem proud of this. I'm not sure I've seen anything like it before. I mean, what was your reaction?
I mean, the image that this conjures in my mind are all of the same things that we saw from Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib, these kind of things, these images that we saw all of those years ago. What this is, to me, is emblematic of the kind of dehumanization of the other that you get when you administer an apartheid regime. This is the kind of othering that you have. There's another part to this as well, which is the continual desire to paint all adult fighting capability Palestinian men as being treated like they are members of Hamas or the Qassam Brigades, when of course the Qassam Brigade's fighting capacity is 40,000 men, and there are 500,000 men in the Gaza Strip of fighting age. So what this has done is a way to inflate the numbers of the legitimate military targets and civilian deaths, because of course the international discussion on this issue has been just quite the scale of civilian casualties that they have been. So you have to massage those figures somewhat by trying to ensure that you can paint the picture of more people dying as being legitimate military targets than necessarily have been, by using this broad category of what constitutes a legitimate military target. One thing I would also talk about, if we're going to talk about the level to which the Israel are unembarrassed of their own output on these things, and Channel 14 in specific, there was another story from Channel 14 just yesterday discussing what's called the Netzarim corridor. Now, this is a 2-kilometer wide exclusion zone between North and South Gaza. So this is where an old Israeli settlement used to be, and they've paved a road from the armistice line all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, using it as a checkpoint in which people cannot cross from the south back up to the north. This 2-kilometer long exclusion zone involved the demolishing of 2 separate hospitals within this area as well. And the only people who are allowed to cross are quote unquote legitimate humanitarian convoys. And I'm sure there'll be very stringent restrictions on what they might be. What first this is a direct violation of the statements made by Antony Blinken over there being no reduction in territory within Gaza. Of course, there is this 2-kilometer long exclusion zone, and there is, of course, the buffer zone around the armistice line of 1 kilometer as well, which is in violation of what Blinken said as well. And on top of that, my mind is cast back to when Elon Levy, in conversation with Christian Guru Murthy, specifically said, well, of course, if we're going to attack Rafah, we want to get civilians to get out of the way, so they have to go back up north to places already cleared. I'm like, but if you're going to have the North Gaza completely removed from where anybody within Rafah can get to, then there is literally nowhere for them to go, which then we have to go back to what Benny Gantz was saying earlier on in that clip about there being no choice in terms of the ultimatum when they eventually could attack Rafah post-Ramadan should Hamas not release the hostages, which of course they have offered a hostage deal on a 4-month ceasefire, which Israel have rejected at this point. And the last point I'd make is it just shows the level to which Israel are allowed to get away with things that other people might not be able to. Remember how there's a strategic corridor that Putin has established between Rostov and Crimea, which was the justification, I guess, in military terms, for the occupation of Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts in Ukraine, because that's where they can use as ability to be able to conduct strategic military attacks between anywhere from Crimea up to the Rostov Oblast. And that received international condemnation by the international community from the West, as it rightly should. Yet when we get the same amount of what is occupation in terms of Gaza and this exclusion zone, which involving demolishing loads of buildings, including hospitals, absolute silence and crickets. I wonder why.